Our topic for today is self-awareness for social justice. And um, as you already know, my name is Meagan Pollock, and my company is called Engineer Inclusion. And I have with me today my colleague Chanel Beebe. She's based in Michigan, and she'll be helping contribute to the conversation. And if you have any technical issues, you can contact her as well. So again, today our topic is self-awareness for social justice, and the talk today is divided into three parts. So the first part is we're going to talk about self-awareness. I'm going to share with you some of the insights from the book Insight by Dr. Tasha Eurich. And after that, then we're going to connect that to understanding what is social justice, and then what does that mean for us? How do we connect self-awareness for social justice within our sphere of influence? So let's start off with self-awareness. So a good old definition from the dictionary is self-awareness is conscious knowledge of one's own character, feelings, motives, and desires. And the research tells us that when we see ourselves clearly, we are more confident, more creative, we make better decisions, we build stronger relationships, and we communicate more effectively. In addition, we are less likely to lie, cheat, and steal. We are better workers who get more promotions. And finally, we're more effective leaders with more satisfied employees and more profitable companies. These are all amazing things, right? That would benefit us in many aspects of our lives. And they are a result of seeing ourselves clearly. And so let's dive in to understand a little bit about self-awareness. One of my favorite books is by Dr. Tasha Eurich, called Insight, The Surprising Truth About How Others See Us, How We See Ourselves, and Why the Answers Matters More Than You Think. One of her earlier versions, I think her hardback version, is Why We're Not as Self-Aware as We Think We Are. That was the subtitle. So she changed it for this version. And so she's a really phenomenal person, a role model of mine, mainly because she's my age and has like a best-selling book and just a really cool business and impact on the world. And so we're going to be talking about this study that she released in this book. And so what this book is the result of is that her and her team of researchers created a large-scale scientific study around self-awareness. And so it involved 10 separate investigations with nearly 5,000 participants, and they were examining what self-awareness really is, why we need it, and how we can increase it. And their research revealed many surprising roadblocks, myths, and truths about what self-awareness is and what it takes to improve it. And so I'm going to talk about her book through three parts. The first is that there are two types of self-awareness. And the second is that experience and power hinder self-awareness. And then the third part of their work that I'm going to talk about is that introspection doesn't always improve self-awareness. And so one of the key things, and I'll say this again later, but they found that even though most people believe they are self-aware, self-awareness is a pretty rare quality. And so they estimate that only about 10 to 15% of the people that they studied actually fit the criteria of a self-aware person. And so again, we aren't as self-aware as we think we are generally. And so this is going to give us a couple of ways to look at it, and then we'll bridge that to understanding the impacts around educational equity. So first off, there are two different types of self-awareness. The first is internal self-awareness. Now, this represents how clearly we see our own values, our passions, our aspirations, how clearly we see how we fit within an environment. It's our awareness of our reactions. So that includes our thoughts, our feelings, our behaviors. It's our perception of our strengths, what we're good at and what we're not so good at. And then I think the biggest connection to our conversation today is our self-awareness of our impact on others. We're going to talk a little bit about privilege towards the end of the hour, and that's really understanding and we'll talk about bias too. That's a key to understanding our impact on others, right? Like if we don't understand how our bias and privilege affects others, we aren't self-aware in a social justice kind of way. And so that's where we want to do some work. This book since both of you, Kelly and Ray Scott, are leaders, I recommend reading it because her work is really designed around leadership. And I actually took a course from her on inclusive leadership and not inclusive leadership, on insightful, self-aware leadership. And so I recommend reading the book. And if you ever want to talk about some of her other work, I'm a super fan, so I'd be glad to do it. Actually, I was supposed to get to meet her in person last year at a conference that got canceled because of COVID. So, sad face. But like she and I had actually talked, and it was so exciting. But she's a really cool person, and I recommend reading her work. So I'll try to keep that in mind as I go throughout the conversation and sort of frame some of the narratives from the lens of leadership as well. So the second type of self-awareness is an external self-awareness. So this is our understanding of how other people view us in terms of the same factors that were listed on the other slide. And so their research found that people who know how others see them are more skilled at showing empathy and taking others' perspectives. So I believe that to be an inclusive educator, to be an inclusive leader, you must have a high external self-awareness, because that to be an inclusive leader requires a deep amount of empathy. And that can be developed. It's not like you have it or you don't. It takes practice and effort to develop those kinds of things. And so if we want to be inclusive leaders, we must develop this external self-awareness. And so they found that for leaders who see themselves as their employees do, their employees tend to have a better relationship with them. They feel more satisfied with them and see them as more effective in general, right? And so, if for your students who are within your programs, for the faculty and staff who work for you, it's really good for us to understand how our people who work with us see us as well. So they map through their work 4 self-awareness archetypes. And so it's a 2x2 map where it maps the internal self-awareness with the low external self-awareness. So we've got the 2x2 matrix here. And so let's start in the top left. So the introspectors. So introspectors have a high internal self-awareness. So they spend a lot of time or high capability of understanding who they are, but they have a low external self-awareness. So they know who they are, but they don't challenge their own views or search for blind spots by getting feedback from others. I really like her word choice on blind spots here, because it's a great connection to bias that we're going to talk about, especially because the name of this book is called Blind Spot: The Hidden Biases of Good People. And so this is by Banaji, and it's actually in the links that I dropped into the chat. I think it's the second link, the fourth link there on my list there. So I like that word choice, because again, for us to be inclusive and equitable educators and individuals, we have to continue to develop that awareness of our blind spots. So moving down below that are the seekers. So seekers have low internal self-awareness and low external self-awareness. So they're not self-aware at all, right? Like they don't know who they are, they don't know where they stand, or as a leader, they don't know how their teams see them at all, right? And so as a result, they might feel kind of stuck and frustrated with their performance or with their relationships. Moving across the bottom there, the third archetype are pleasers. So pleasers have a low internal self-awareness and a high external self-awareness. So these people can be really focused on appearing a specific way, like in an inauthentic way, to avoid, again, they're just trying to sort of present themselves in a certain way, sort of anchoring and predetermining what other people might think of them. And so over time, they have a tendency to make choices that aren't in service of their own success and fulfillment, because they act from this place of pleasing others. And then the fourth archetype is high external and high internal. self-awareness. So these people, they know who they are, what they want to accomplish, and they seek out and value others' opinions. And so in this quadrant is where leaders really begin to realize the true benefits of self-awareness. And I don't see any of these as like truly black or white, right? Like it's there's a lot of gray in the middle of you don't have to be 100% externally self-aware and 100% internally self-aware. We can fall on a continuum within both of those ways of looking at this. So certainly our goal is to move to that high external and high internal self-awareness so that we have that aware archetype and that we can learn to practice and fulfill that. So the next, the third of the topics is that experience and power hinder self-awareness. So what they found is that people don't always learn from experience, and research, not just Dr. Urix found this, but in general, people don't always learn from experience. Expertise does not help people root out false information. And seeing ourselves as highly experienced can keep us from doing our homework, seeking disconfirming evidence, and questioning our assumptions. And so to me, like, this is really powerful that, you know, when we think about our career trajectories, we can get into a place of feeling like we have, you know, more expertise and experience and we have less to learn. I'm reminded when I think of this perspective of a teacher from a school district that I was doing a professional learning day with years ago. And I show up, it's got my coffee in hand. And the first thing that she says to me is she's like, "Hi, my name is so-and-so. I've been best teacher in the district for 5 years running. I'm the department chair. And there's nothing that you can say to me today that's going to help me learn anything new." And at first I thought she was joking, right? Because that's such a strange thing to say. But she was like super serious. And she said it without batting an eye, like I should just take it in stride. But what she was revealing to me is that she was clearly unaware of opportunities for her to learn. And it's also evidence of a deeply fixed mindset that there's nothing that you're going to be able to teach me that's going to make any difference. And it made me think, like, well, what is it like to be in your class if you think you've reached the pinnacle of learning? And it could be, her response could have been that she saw me and saw me as I was younger back then, and didn't think that there was anything that I could have taught her, because I was probably still in my 20s back then. And maybe she just had some bias and age judgment to that. But in hindsight, she told me afterwards that she did learn something. And so that was good. But the point of that is that our experience and our power can get in the way, right? And so just as experience can lead to a false sense of confidence about our performance, it can also make us overconfident about our level of self-knowledge. This, you know, my colleague Chanel that's with us here, she and I are both engineers, and there's a sort of running joke, and it's not really a joke because it's true, that engineers can do anything, right? And the joke is that I truly believe that, right? And I grew up thinking that because my dad is a engineer by trade. He is self-taught. After I think 40 years of programming, they finally let him be called an engineer. But I grew up with that mentality of like, I can do anything, I can figure it out. And so that's like part of my MO and how I function in this world, is I kind of believe that. And that's problematic because you can often overestimate and have greater confidence that you can accomplish something than's necessarily possible. And Chanel offered something in the last session and said, like, this can become a privilege, right? That we sort of privilege engineers. Go ahead, Chanel, if you want to pop in and share what you said earlier.
Yeah, I was just commenting on the idea that I know when I became an engineer, my family and everybody is just like, you can do anything related to tech, anything related to, generally, unfortunately, anything I don't know, right? So it doesn't actually have to be engineering things, but you now have this ability to find knowledge, and that becomes something that people treat you differently according to, right? People take your opinions about things more seriously. People give you a lot of kind of unearned advantage in different scenarios. For example, we were planning a trip, and my family just took my perspective on the city none of us had ever been to. And then when we got there, and like one of the things that I suggested didn't quite pan out, And they were just like, well, why didn't you know? And I was like, how would I have known? I don't know what you assume. They're like, you do this. And I'm like, no, I do completely other than this, right? And that privilege, I didn't really realize that my suggestion for an activity had gotten prioritized just because people assume she thinks she's smart, so she clearly knows the best way to have a good time in a city she's never been in before.
Yeah. And I'm sure that all of you, Allison, Ray Scott, and Kelly, as leaders, probably get a lot of assumptions too, that like, something, that your experience and your power assumes that everything. And this happens to all of us. One of the things that Dr. Brene Brown is just coming out with is some really cool new stuff on leadership, and it challenges that sort of standard leadership of like, well, of course I know, to being a little bit more courageous in our leadership and saying, okay, we don't know, but like, let's figure it out together. And so some of her new podcasts on her Dare to Lead, I recommend those. Are really good. So the final point that they make around this is that the more power a leader holds, again, the more likely that they are to overestimate their skills and abilities. I think we see this evidence in a lot of the people who get hired to be CEOs of these really big tech firms. And they're like a CEO for less than a year and then get a golden parachute for like, $7 million. And to me, that's generally like a big overestimate of what they thought that they could do. And it could certainly be the system around them affected their ability to be successful as well. But I do think that this happens a lot. The next part of this is that in their interviews, they found that people who improved their external self-awareness did so by seeking out feedback from loving critics. And they define loving critics as people who have their best interest in heart, best interest in mind, and are willing to tell them the truth. And so feedback, not only is learning to give feedback a skill, learning to receive feedback is a skill. And one I wish we could teach people sooner. I didn't learn how to receive feedback until I was my late 20s, maybe early 30s. And a lot of it was about trust. A lot of it was about moving from a fixed to a growth mindset, because a fixed mindset person has a really hard time accepting feedback, whereas a growth mindset sees it as the intent that it is to help someone be successful. But when it comes to thinking about our work to ensure educational equity, to be inclusive leaders, I think this is really important. One of the things I tried to do in my previous role in an organization where I was a leader in the organization was to create a culture of feedback. And believe it or not, I got a lot of pushback. Nobody wanted it. But I felt that to have a culture of feedback where we were all loving critics of one another would help us all become more self-aware of our strengths and our opportunities to grow. But people are so reticent to have feedback because they take it as some kind of indictment against them. And so that is a big sign of really low external self-awareness, when you're not willing to accept and certainly not seeking out feedback.
Meagan, can I interrupt just a second and say, Kelly has given me some of the best feedback. But I think maybe feedback, loving criticism, takes a relationship. I mean, we've traveled together, we've, gone through many experiences together. And Ray Scott is just the best at giving. He's just he's got the best way to communicate. Of course, that's, he's an expert at that, but oh my goodness. But I just know Kelly can tell me things that other people can't tell me, or I won't take it. Maybe they'll tell me and I don't, and I have that it's a blind spot, but Kelly really connects. But I think it's about, it does have to do something with relationships. I don't know.
You're absolutely right. I mean, feedback to be truly received requires trust. And there's a lot that I could do a whole workshop on feedback and what the research says and how it links to our self-efficacy and our mindset. Um, and feedback is particularly effective. Feedback is particularly important for marginalized populations who have the research shows who have a tendency to have lower trust of their teachers, who are in many cases not the same race or background as them. But when teachers give really effective feedback, it helps to build that relationship. It builds a bridge. It's not about pushing people away, it's about bringing people in. And how it happens is when you give good feedback, it's really called wise feedback, from Carl Yeager out of UT Austin. It's giving an indication of high standards and a belief that someone can meet them. So I'm giving you this feedback because I have high expectations for you and I believe that you can meet them. That is what they call wise feedback, and that builds trust and builds relationship, and it increases students' interest in doing the work, right? But again, feedback, people shy away from it, and I think from a business standpoint, there is a horrific trend, not even a trend, it's just a tradition of only doing feedback once a year. And it's useless. And the research shows that it's useless. And when I had full-time employees that worked for me, when we got to their annual review, there was not a single surprise. We had talked about everything, and I'm really good friends with some of the people who used to work for me full time, and they give me really good feedback. And Kathleen, who works for, one of my partners, she happens to be also the age of my mother. And so there was a weird kind of age difference there. And she told me that, and again, this is about being self-aware, externally self-aware, is that she loved working for me because she always knew where she stood, because there was never a surprise on the feedback I was going to give her. But she also said it was really hard to work for me because I had such high expectations, and I believe that she didn't believe that she can meet my expectations. And so that's feedback that I've received, and I'm really aware of when I work with people of like, am I setting too high of expectations for people? And if I am, what am I doing to help them believe that they can do that? But I can say when she offered me that feedback, it was hard feedback to take because I didn't see the problem with it, right? I'm like, well, of course I have high expectations for you. But instead of asking, one of the next points is, instead of asking, well, why is that a problem? I should have asked, well, what is it that I can do to help you believe that you can meet them, right? And so we're not quite to that point yet, but the next key thing that they found in this work is that introspection doesn't always improve self-awareness. And so they found that the people who introspect are less self-aware, and they report worse job satisfaction and general well-being. And the sort of next part to that is, it's the problem's not that introspection is ineffective, it's that most people are doing it wrong. And so they go on to say that the most common question is why, right? Why do you think this? Or why is this happening to me? Or why did I fly off the handle? Or why am I so against this? And so the problem with asking why isn't just how wrong we are, but it's how confident we are that we're right? Because it's trying to get to an answer, and there's not always an answer, right? And so our minds, the human mind, rarely operates in rational fashion, and our judgments are seldom, and I would argue never, free from bias. And so we tend to sort of pounce on whatever insights or solutions that we find, and we don't question their validity, right? We just ignore evidence, and we force our thoughts to conform to whatever it is that is our initial explanation. And so again, it's not effective because it sort of pushes us in a corner, and it can be anchored in our bias, because the way our mind really operates when we try to find solutions is that it anchors on stereotypes and assumptions and beliefs. And so instead of asking why, we need to ask what. And so to increase our productive self-insight and to decrease unproductive rumination, we need to ask what, not why. And so these what questions, they help us stay objective. They are future focused, and they empower us to act on new insights. It gives us something to do, right? Instead of just saying, well, this is the solution that we've sort of cornered and we think is the answer, it tells us what we can do. So in using an example with Kathleen, instead of saying, well, why is it that you don't think that you can meet my expectations? A much better question would have been is like, well, what can I do? Like I said, what can I do to help you feel like you can meet those expectations? And then she could have given me feedback if she had that. So again, we should ask what, not why. So wrapping up this, the self-awareness piece here is that people, individuals, leaders who focus on building both internal and external self-awareness, who seek honest feedback, and who ask what instead of why, we can learn to see ourselves more clearly. And we, in turn, reap the many rewards that increased self-knowledge delivers. And so we're going to connect that here as we move on to understand and talk about social justice. But again, because we got a small group, I want to pause.
Yeah, I had a comment on the what versus why. So earlier I made the comment about how that shift was kind of profound for me because of the like axis of problem solving in it. So like when something's happened, you're trying to find out why because you want to solve the problem. And I feel like asking what allows you to solve the problem in a different perspective. And I think when we now hearing it for the second time now today, I'm seeing another connection between the even I guess overall presence to even be seeking another perspective, you know. And I think as we think about connecting self-awareness and understanding why I'm now like the full circle moment has happened. I'm like, aha, I see how, you know, taking time to ask what would increase your self-awareness because you have to seek another perspective in order to even care about what, right? Because why is a lot more comfortable for the emotional response to whatever might be happening, but also to the intellectual desire to get the thing over with, you know, and to get to a place where the thing is gone. I wasn't expecting to get another thing on it. I was like, you know, just kind of listening to see if that same connection will be made again. But it was +1. So I guess that's a good sign, right?
Yeah. And as you say that, I'm also thinking like by saying why, we're externalizing and deflecting the feedback because it's putting the onus on the individual to produce a solution, but it's not putting anything on us. Like there's no responsibility or accountability that you take in that. Whereas if we ask why, and true inclusive leaders take accountability for things. And that's one of the things I'm going to put on I haven't told you all yet, but the Online Center for Teaching and Learning, which Kelly, you probably already know about, but I'm developing a course on inclusive leadership. So this will be included on that platform. But one of the key things is if we want to be inclusive leaders, we must be accountable, right? And take responsibility, because so often when it comes to when we receive feedback, we deflect that. I noticed this, Chanel, on an email that came from somebody very high up at Purdue last year, right after the racial riots from the George Floyd murder. And the email that came, it was sent to us from somebody really high up, and they wanted us to reflect on all of the racial and gender inequities that we experienced as a student. Like these are really big questions that like I don't have like a library of them in my brain, right? I mean, that's not how these things work. They're usually really small, subtle things. And so one of the other graduates responded with a really thoughtful response, but yet it was a bit of a critique saying like, he didn't say this is wacky because he's a scholar, but essentially he was saying like, what are you doing? And like, this isn't appropriate, and it's triggering, and it's really ineffective, and it doesn't get to the root of the issue. And instead of responding with, let me listen, why don't you tell me more, she responded with, well, I'm doing this because I care. And she deflected it, right? And it could have been a tremendous, and this was a reply all to all graduates of this program, to like this big sort of splashy mess. And I don't know if I ever responded to her, but I wanted to say like, this is when you stop and you listen. And instead of saying, but I have Black friends, but I'm really a nice person, and but my intentions were good, it's when you say, what can I do better, rather than, well, why are you blaming me for not doing enough?
And I think people often don't see that deflection. I mean, it's hard to see deflection, and I think if you could see it, you wouldn't do it. But I think people don't see it as deflection because implicitly in their head, they're assuming that you don't know what their motivation might be, right? So they're trying to answer an unasked why, as opposed to focusing on the what, right? So I think the woman might be, well, I might be getting this feedback because he clearly doesn't know why I'm doing this. He clearly doesn't know why I feel like this is an okay question to ask. And I feel that that's an okay question to ask because I have Black friends. So let me offer that, right? As opposed to the personal question of what will make someone say that to me, right? What might happen? What can I do to help them to see what my perspective might be? Because if I ask myself that, then like you pointed out earlier, Allison, there's a relationship that isn't there, right? This person might not understand, what our motivations are, or why I even came to this project, right? And even that is more generative and will allow more conversation for then you to end up seeing, oh, actually, I can see how this might be triggering, And I think a lot of times people think that we're asking people to, foresee every case in which they might be triggering. And it's really, we're asking you to be open enough so that when a trigger is brought up to you, you're able to validate it, right? And respond to it and not continue to trigger it.
Yeah.
Which is
Truly.
what usually happens, unfortunately.
I wanted to say in that situation, it sounds like that, truly becomes more performative than substantive because it is about defending that person's opinion. And why would she assume that she has a relationship with all of the graduates? Do you know what I'm saying? And so, yeah, it's nobody wants to be, called out for behavior, but at the same time, it seems so transparent that what that scenario gives evidence to is a fear of being called out. Fundamentally, and but anyway, yeah. Oof. That's a mess.
And I think in the book White Fragility, and just by definition, that really, when we as a white person and as white people experience this sort of fragility around race, that's anchored in the why, not the what, right? It's not asking, okay, what can I do? It's saying, well, why are you blaming me, right? Like, I didn't own slaves, and like this sort of diatribe that you go through of like, but I didn't do this. We should be asking, well, what can I do to make a change on this? Yeah. All right, so I want to connect this now to the social justice, and so I think it's useful to again, let's go back to the root of the words and to the definitions, because we do know that social justice has become a really kind of polarized term, and polarized in the sense that it's become so politicized. And so let's start with the word just, right? So just by definition, it's acting or being in conformity with what is morally right or good. It's being what is merited or deserved. And then on the flip side, on the legal side, it's like what's correct. And so when we think about what's morally right or up good, like that's subjective, right? Like that's subjective based on one's beliefs, one's values. And so there's also a lot of bias in how we perceive what is just. But then when we take a step further and look at this as justice. So justice, it's the quality of being just, of practicing that sort of impartiality or fairness. And then again, from the legal side, it's the administration of the law. And especially, this is where it brings in the keyword equity here. It's the establishment or determination of rights according to the rules of law or equity. And it's important to note here that this is a system, right? It's a system of justice. And so we talked a lot about systems last month. And so now social justice, it's how fairness manifests in society. And it depends on 4 fundamental goals: human rights, access, participation, and equity. And so the lack of these items can be barriers in the workplace in limiting marginalized and minoritized individual potential. And so from the dictionary, the definition is it's a state or doctrine of egalitarianism. And I'm not going to add to look that up. And so I thought maybe I'll share it with you too. And so egalitarianism, it's a belief in human equality. And that's certainly something I can raise my hand to say that I support, and especially with respect to social, political, and economic affairs. And then it's a philosophy of advocating the removal of inequalities among people. And so with these definitions, we've got 2 other words, equality and equity. And so I've got a little video that sort of illustrates the difference between the 2, because I think people often get them confused. So let's watch this brief video. If the audio is not turned on, please let me know, but I think it is. So here we go. You hear?
What is the difference between equality and equity? Equality is when everyone gets the same. For example, everyone should have the same rights and access to opportunity. However, our systems, institutions, laws, and policies weren't built with true equality in mind. So equality isn't reality. Federal legislations have attempted to right these inequalities, but legislation alone cannot repair a complex system. The lasting impact creates systemic inequities in access and opportunity. As a result, marginalized groups face even more challenges, and dominant groups receive an unearned advantage or privilege. Equity compensates for systemic inequalities. It is an effort to give everyone what they need to succeed. Equity is an explicit effort to level the playing field with the goal of reaching equality. So equality is the goal, and equity is how we get there. Are you an equity builder? You can bridge the gap and lift others up. By activating equity in our pursuit of equality, we can create a more inclusive and just world.
All right, so again, this little video just gives us an illustration to see that, equality is truly what our founding fathers set things up to be, but it wasn't really, right? Like, it was only for select people. And while it was, the language is embedded in our, sort of values and beliefs, the structures and systems that were built don't mirror that. And so as a result, for us to have equality in our country, where the land of the free, is that we have to do a lot of leveling the playing field. And, we often sort of depend on legislation to fix these things, but it doesn't help us in our one-on-ones with people. Interpersonal doesn't help with our systems and our institutions, unless we are really becoming self-aware, and all of us are building the self-awareness to begin to initiate change. And so the next part is where we're going to kind of bridge social justice and self-awareness and connecting the 2 here. And so I'm going to do this in sort of 4 parts. The first is unraveling bias, and this is mostly going to connect us back to the workshop we did in February. And then the next is unpacking our privilege. The third is unclasping, letting go of some of our positions. And then fourth, to unoccupy power. I am aware that unoccupy is not a word, but I think it's clear that when we read it, and it keeps the sort of flow of the uns there, is to sometimes we need to relinquish our power to better serve others. And so again, these last two are really the sort of action pieces. Bias and privilege, like this is just continuing to increase our awareness of ourselves. But awareness isn't enough. We have to do something to lead to that social justice, which is the goal. So back in February, we had a workshop on unraveling bias in the brain. If you want to access it right now, this afternoon, you can go to that link there. It's also in the set of links I put in the chat. But this course is also on the new virtual learning community that you can access shortly. And so the sort of takeaway of that workshop was that if you have a brain, you have bias, because within our brains, there are specific neural networks that hold and maintain and support the stereotypes and prejudices that we all hold. The good news, though, is that we can use our brain also to, through self-regulation and cognitive control, we can reduce the expression of those biases and prejudices and stereotypes. So I have another quick little video here, and I will say that I know the music is too loud and I'm going to fix it. But I can't fix it here. So you might need to turn your audio down just a little bit. And if you want to follow along with the transcript, then you'll get the language. But I do know that the audio is a little loud on this. Finding the egg would have won me a $1,000 prize. Not finding the egg won me an egg once worth $1,000 and a good anecdote for explaining schemas and implicit bias. One year, I was exhibiting at a conference, trying to also attend as many sessions as possible and attempting to make the most of networking opportunities. Needless to say, I felt like I was running around like a chicken with my head cut off. At one of the general sessions, the host told the audience about a special prize they were offering for that day only. If the swag bag we received at registration had an egg in it, then we would be rewarded a $1,000 grant for our organization. Upon returning to my booth, I took a quick scan of my swag bag for an egg and didn't see one. So, with the exhibit hour in full swing, I was quickly consumed by talking with visitors and didn't think of it again. Later that night, I decided to sort through the items in my bag. There was a blank notebook, various flyers and brochures, some branded pens, assorted business cards I dropped in throughout the day, and a 6-inch stuffed object of some sort with a crown and 2 orange feet, plus a book titled What Do You Do With an Idea by Kobe Yamada. After a very quick skim of the book, I suddenly realized with shock and awe that I was holding a $1,000 egg. Urgently, I called and emailed the conference host to let them know the news. However, it was too late. The prize was no longer available. As if the fuzzy egg was mocking me, I questioned myself. How could this happen? After all, I did vaguely recall seeing the object in my bag during my quick search. However, my brain did not associate that object as an egg. Thus, this is really a case of a simple schema. Let's examine a couple of key definitions. A schema describes a pattern of thought or behavior that organizes categories of information and the relationships among them. In our brain, schemas are templates of knowledge or mental shortcuts that are unconsciously accessed and applied, sometimes mistakenly. The resulting assignment of schemas is implicit bias. Implicit or unconscious bias refers to the attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, our actions, and our decisions in an unconscious manner. Our brain relies on schemas even more when we are tired, in a hurry, or stressed. Let's have a look at a schema from my brain. When I thought of eggs, a few images came to mind. A those images, I suspected that the plastic type of egg would be the most logical option to find in my swag bag, since I was tired, in a hurry, and likely stressed. And given I didn't see anything my brain immediately processed as matching my mental schema of an egg, I judged my bag egg-free and moved on. Because I didn't take time to explore the fuzzy object in my bag, and because I didn't make effort to challenge the schemas I held about eggs, my implicit bias cost my organization $1,000. What are the other costs of implicit bias? Implicit bias is everywhere around us, and the most marginalized populations pay the greatest cost, with limited access and opportunity at every turn. Every one of us has implicit bias, and about way more than eggs. It exists at every dimension of who we are, like our race, gender, socioeconomic status, ability, disability, sexuality, religion, ethnicity, nationality, and also distinguishing factors like our clothing, our hairstyle, our body type, or our accent. So what can we do? First, increase awareness of your unconscious biases. Take a few implicit association tests to get started. Number 2, expand your schemas. Find more stories and images that challenge stereotypes. Number 3, be intentional. As the unconscious becomes more conscious, you'll begin to recognize how your biases manifest in your interactions. From there, you can take action and adjust. Remember, this is a journey. And finally, speak up. Challenge stereotypes and kindly support others in expanding their schemas too. And in closing, I hope that you will never forget that some eggs wear crowns. What do we do with bias, right? We had the previous workshop on it, and so I definitely encourage you to dig back and explore that if you missed it. But we can take an implicit association test, and that link is in the chat with some of the others. And then I encourage you to read the book Blind Spot that I showed earlier, because it is a great way to understand what are some of our blind spots and how do we increase our self-awareness around those things. So next is unpacking our privilege. And so if you've never heard of the sort of term of unpacking our privilege, it comes from Dr. Peggy McIntosh's work. And so she's a feminist scholar, but the article that this refers to that she wrote several decades ago is called Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack. And so in that, she sort of translates her work from the feminist space around gender equity to thinking about and reflecting on racial equity. And so she lists through this like examples of things that she doesn't have to think about, that she thinks that she believed that her Black and friends and people of color don't have the privilege of not thinking about, right? And so in the chat, the link number 5 is a link to that article and her sort of narrative around that. I really encourage reading that if you haven't before. I've read it several times, and it's always a really great reminder, because one of the things that she notes in the article is that as soon as she wrote the list, she forgot it, right? And the whole point is that we don't think about these things because they are privileges that we receive unearned as we move through life. And so it's a great reminder to read those things, because it reminds us when we have access to things that we might take for granted, that others may not. And that's her on the right. I've been able to meet her a few times. So our definition of privilege is it's a special right, it's an unearned advantage or some type of immunity that's granted or available only to a particular person or a group. And that's what we're talking about in this case, are the groups. Because, we talked about last month systems of oppression. And so you can't really talk much about systems of oppression without also understanding systems of advantage. And privilege is a system of advantage. And so we have to begin to think about and reflect on the ways in which we might benefit from the systems without realizing it. There are many examples of different kinds of privilege. And so there's a list there. And let me give you some examples. So the privilege of race, so the norm is whiteness, and society is structured as such. The next, from a gender perspective, men are this dominant group, and that the sort of society was built to support them and not to support women. And so there are minimal career opportunities or less career opportunities for women, and those persist. And from a non-traditional career standpoint, which is a lot of the work that we've done together, that's certainly important to reflect on. From a socioeconomic standpoint, if you have money, you don't ever think about money, right? And it's easy to not recognize the privilege that money provides when you don't ever have to think about it in different kinds of ways. And so that stability, or we can, socioeconomic is more than just money. It's also access to different kinds of social capital, which could mean people, resources, networks, and things like that. In the US, and I guess across the globe in many ways, that if you were a Christian, then which is the dominant religion in the US, that there is some privilege there. Heterosexual individuals have privilege because they are able to marry and adopt, and they aren't viewed as others as sexually deviant or deviant in some kind of way. Able-bodied individuals, so you have the ability to physically move through and participate in society in a world that was built for you, right? Something that we face so much over the last year is understanding accessibility in these virtual spaces. And the example of the live transcript is one thing that Zoom, to their credit, worked really hard to get that implemented and included in the cost of the service, because that's an accessibility for people who need it, because the system wasn't built for them. Nationality and geographic location kind of go hand in hand to me, because with the Western privilege that we have with the US passport, it generally means we can access any country, whereas some people don't have that privilege. Education is really critical. The more education you have, the more doors it opens. Somebody told me early on when I was, before I decided to start my PhD, I asked someone why they had their PhD, and she said, it's a secret handshake. And she was right. My PhD is certainly a secret handshake that sort of opens up doors that I didn't have access to before I had that. And so it is a privilege. Right-handedness, English speaking, the birth order, in some families, you have access or different rights and given to the firstborn, and in different countries this is different as well. Age, so people who are considered more experienced based on their age, but yet there's also sort of a critical point when you intersect that with gender, like it's very different for women and how they're perceived in the workforce. And so again, these intersecting layers of privilege, and we talked about that last month. Body size, gender identity, there are norms around all of these, and if you fit those norms, you benefit from a privilege that is unearned, right? Like you just get to move through life and not have to think about those things, and so you don't always recognize what you are missing. So last month we talked about systems of oppression in our workshop. And so if you need a refresher on that, I encourage you to go back and listen to that, because again, to understand system of advantages, we have to understand the systems of disadvantage. And so one way to look at that is using the 4 I's: ideological, interpersonal, institutional, and internalized. And again, check out that video to learn more about that. So the video I'm going to play here in a second is the video is called The Unequal Opportunity Race. And it helps depict structural inequalities And so what you'll notice is it's a metaphor, it's a race that you're looking at. And so some things to look for, because there's a lot going on. And so, you'll see on the left side of the screen, there's a clock. So that's something to pay attention to. There'll be words that will be splashed across the screen, and certainly imagery to look at. This can be triggering to you. And so, take care of yourself in that space if that's something that you need to care for yourself and whatever you need to do. And I want to also say that I want to encourage you to ask what, not why, when you're watching this, because it can put us in a place of not focusing on what we can take from it. And so find yourself asking what, not why. Can you hear it? All right, so there's a lot to unpack in that video, and the sort of takeaway that I want to sort of offer to you is thinking about the sort of juxtaposition of roadblocks versus the fast lane. And so when many white people particularly watch this or hear the words privilege, they very quickly sort of declare but my family doesn't have any money, and I grew up poor, and I've worked for everything that I have, and they don't even see what's happening to the other individuals within this sort of imagery and the race there. And what we want to help people see is the sort of system that creates the structures of all of the different things that were happening to the racers along the way. And even if one has a hard time recognizing any form of privilege, look and think about what were the roadblocks that that the people of color faced in this, that we as a white person may not have faced. And so again, the point here is recognizing the sort of system of advantage versus a system of disadvantage that either affects us and pushes us in the fast lane or creates roadblocks for people. So sort of homework that you can do around this is to better understand yourself. So I recently created an exercise on positionality. It's a pretty in-depth exercise. And so positionality, the exercise helps you to understand yourself, but it understands how you're situated within your environment as a leader, as a researcher, as someone who engages in the world around you. So it encourages both internal and external self-awareness. And so that's in the link, and I encourage you to do that when you have a chance. So the last 2 points here are to unclasp our position and unoccupy power. And so there are sort of 3 ways of looking at this sort of action assignment. One is that there are many of us people who are unaware, and one can say, you don't know what you don't know. But at some point we make a decision to choose to not know things, right? I think about my parents, my lovely, wonderful parents, and I have invited them on this journey with me of learning about equity. And at some point they've made a choice that they don't want to be aware. And in some ways has sort of gone backwards in whatever progress we would have made together. And so it's not okay to just be unaware. When you meet someone who says, well, I don't know anything about that, I can show you a stack of books, right, that you could read, right, or podcasts, or Twitter handles that you can follow to learn. In the world that we live in, like, information is everywhere, and it's accessible. And so the next place that you could be is that you're aware and you don't care. And then the final place where we all want to be is that we are aware of these things and we care and we want to make a difference and change. A couple of years ago, this quote came across my Facebook feed, and it just punched me in the gut. And it's powerful to me because it says, when people are woke enough to know the language to discuss race, gender, class, oppression generally. And that describes me. Like, this is something I've been doing as a professional for over a decade. But then the next part is what punched me in the gut, but not quite woke enough to give anything up: space, power, platform, reputation, position. This is arguably the most destructive pattern of behavior of our time. And so if you need a definition of a woke person is someone who is aware and actively attentive to important facts and issues, especially issues of racial and social justice. And so again, it's not just about being aware, but it's about thinking of your action and what is the action that you're going to take. And so when we think about the sort of systems of advantage and disadvantage, if I continue to allow myself to benefit from these systems, they benefit me, but they oppress other people. I am complicit in upholding the systems of oppression of other people. I don't want to be, right? So I have to ask and think, when do I need to give up power? When do I need to amplify someone else instead of myself here? Whose voice is missing and needs to be heard? And how do I find them and bring them in and push them forward? Is this position not for me? Like, I can maybe get this job, but am I the best person for this job? I interviewed several years ago, as an executive director position of an organization that served a Hispanic population. And I took the interview to tell them that. I said, you cannot hire me as a white person to come in for your all Hispanic staff who serve a Hispanic community. That I am not the right person for that job. And maybe they didn't have me in mind anyways. I was just sort of filling a space, but it felt important to me. Like, I would feel so uncomfortable ever accepting that job because of the sort of white savior complex that comes with that. And I often think about even the last job that I had running an organization where we provided summer physics camps for girls. And our goal was to serve primarily urban Dallas, which is predominantly Black students. I felt uncomfortable doing that too. I thought, like, am I here this sort of white savior coming in to serve? And how am I incorporating their voices in this? Am I giving up my power and position to include their voices in these decisions? And so again, it's the practice of asking these questions. We may not always come up with the answer, but it's asking, like, do I need to step aside here and push someone else forward? So again, I offer this to you because I found this incredibly profound and powerful. I have some colleagues who don't like this quote, but I continue to show it because it means a lot to me. Yeah. So this really concludes the mapping together of our three things here: self-awareness, social justice, and then understanding how these combine and figuring out what is it that we need to do to contribute to the social justice. And so I'll open it up for more conversation and discussion to you. I'll leave with this quote that I often do, and it's Janetta Sagan. She says, "Silence in the face of injustice is complicity with the oppressor." And so, as I said earlier, if I remain silent by benefiting from the systems that oppress other people, I am complicit in the structures that continue to oppress others. And I don't want to be that person. And so it takes an action, and it takes a continued development of a lens of making change and leading change. And so I encourage you to join me in that journey and let us no longer be silent and complicit in the oppression of others. With that, any questions from you all, comments, thoughts?
One thing I was thinking about, Megan, is, because as professors, right, we're in the classroom, and, I think about, of course, all the work that I need to do, right? That, I love the homework, and I'm down, and I'm going to get after it and all that. But especially in the beginning, when you were talking about, creating a culture of feedback within the classroom, I'm particularly thinking about. And I feel like there are so many yield signs, stop signs, even within the classroom, even this younger generation who, they just, in some ways, they don't even want to go there because it's difficult. I don't even know exactly what I'm saying, but like the idea that we have high standards and we believe they can get there, sometimes it's just also so difficult to communicate that to students who have so many challenges. They keep shooting themselves in the foot in a way. And not to say that I just don't know. I don't know if Ray Scott, you could speak to this too, but, I try to work with my students and say, of course, I'm willing to work with you and this and that and the other and all this. And it's like, I feel like they don't, no matter what I say, they don't believe in themselves. And so anyway, I guess I'm just listening to that.
So were you with us last month, Kelly?
Yes.
So one of the things that we talked about in understanding systems of oppression is the system of internalized oppression, right? And so when we think about that and what individuals might be experiencing, it helps us to recognize it's not the student, it's the system, right? That's affecting their belief in themselves.
Right.
And I think that that's really important, because how we communicate with others, again, this is where the self-awareness is really useful, because you might think that you're communicating high expectations and belief in them, but are you really, right? Your body language could be saying something else. Your tone could be saying something else. Like, this is how micro messaging happens. It's subtle, and it happens in our interactions. And so this is where it's really useful to have someone, a peer observe you and say, like, do you notice that I'm treating these students any differently that would allow, them to not believe that I have high expectations for them? Because that's what happens in our brain, right? Like, we hold these biases and these stereotypes and these beliefs. And if we get to a place of we're sort of these and thosing of these students, those students, and they don't, that means that all of us, are tagging them with a whole set of assumptions and beliefs. And then that is going to get communicated not only through the words you say, but the tone that you say, the way that you say it. And that could be delivering a message that's opposite of what you intend.
Right. Yep. I do. I can see that.
I mean, there's no like patch I can give you. It's again, it's a way of sort of rethinking. Another approach that you could take is looking at some of the work around a strengths-based approach, like an asset belief system of recognizing what is it that these students bring to the class that adds value, rather than looking at them at what they don't bring.
Right. I have a really good friend who was teaching in El Paso. And she did, she didn't call it that, but it was really interesting to me. And I never got more information from her, but it was about where she would communicate with these students, and many of them were Hispanic and, were bilingual. And she said, you have no command of the English language, but you're bringing to this climate and this culture a bilingual approach. And so that in and of itself, you've achieved more than, many of your peers, because you know 2 languages. You're just not yet able to use it in writing in the same way that a native speaker is, and so she would do this sort of snapshot of telling them what their strengths are and making them particularly aware of what they are, which I thought was a really interesting approach, because, and it somehow worked into her grading system and things. But anyway, there's that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I'm very fortunate in teaching performing arts to be able to seek out and find the strengths that each individual has and really highlight them for the students so that they can see immediately what they're quote unquote good at or quote unquote not good at. And by good and bad, that doesn't mean that they're good or they're bad. It's just mean it communicates better on stage. For example, today in Voice for the Stage, some people speak softer, some people speak louder, some people speak whatever, but they all were able to communicate. So it's easy to point those strengths out to them because everybody can see them at the same time. It's not written on a piece of paper that only the teacher sees or that only the student gets the note about. So in a lecture class, you can say, that's a good answer, good job. But in the classes like mine, I can hold up a student and say, guys, learn from this person. This person has a really interesting point of view, or this person sounds a particular way because of their ethnicity. And that's going to help them communicate with this group of people in a way that you might not be able to, but see how they use their body to help them communicate that. So it's a wonderful environment for that, that I wish that I could take that and put it in all of my classes.
Yeah.
But when you're sitting down listening to a teacher, other than, getting feedback going and things like that, it helps, but you don't always get that direct ability to point out a strength or weakness in a way that everyone can see.
Yeah.
Class.
Yeah, that would be great.
And I would think in an art class, Kelly, if it's something you've got your hands on, you can kind of do that too. But if you're talking about art history, it's harder to do that.
Yeah. Well, and I have tried to really rethink the whole thing. It's just I have prejudice and bias about how these things, meeting certain standards and trying to think creatively about how to reach standards that are more team-based and inquisitive, developing. Like for me, it's really more important that my students learn how to think than it is for them to know art history. I mean, that's not really what it's about, or art appreciation or film and culture, whatever. I want them to be able to think. And so yeah, I'm reading a book right now called Think Again by Adam Grant that's talking a lot about how you can restructure your classroom. It has some interesting ideas so that it isn't that it's exactly what you talked about, Ray Scott. It's the thing that comes directly to me, and there are 150 of them in a week. And so how do you individually give feedback to 150 people effectively and also build that? I mean, do you know what I'm saying? It just becomes it's difficult. It's a challenge to give every single person the attention that they deserve and require and need and all of that, in a way that you're also doing the second thing, not just assessing, but you're also doing the constant building up, or communicating the strengths. And so, maybe I need to think about doing things where it's, group work and they come back and they do get immediate direct feedback before they even turn in that piece of paper. Or maybe the assignment is transformed into something where it's not that, I just don't have a ton of experience with that. So it feels a little, scary, I guess. It's like, am I going to do this effectively? It's like, there was something you said, it's like, you're just not even aware that, you're trying to be aware, but you're not even conscious of your unawareness or something. I can't remember, but anyway, yeah. So I'm trying, I'm working on it.
Yeah.
For sure.
I have a question.
Yes, sir.
Frequently in my classes, I have to, and I won't say use the word correct, I have to help a student enhance their ability to communicate a certain set of words that they have grown up using that makes perfect sense to them, but it's not communicable to a broader group of people. And I'll use an example, the pronunciation of the word asks, A-S-K-S. And obviously in a voice for the stage class, that's the perfect place to address that. And I try to address it not as it's wrong. It's not wrong. It's just not the most effective way to communicate the literature that we're dealing with in the environment in which we're dealing with it. And so I do that, and I help the student to pronounce the word. Am I violating the student's cultural sense? Am I helping the student? Am I holding back the student? Should I ignore that particular situation?
So what you're talking about is code switching, right? that people have, particularly it's common within marginalized communities, one way of knowing and doing, and then they learn to assimilate to another way of knowing and doing to be acceptable in a dominant culture. And so the best way to approach that is to acknowledge that what they're doing is okay for their family and their culture, and you teach them that code switching is this thing, but you want to do it in a way that doesn't diminish who they are and their family and their culture and their identity. So you want to affirm them and then say, and the world's this kind of crappy way where we have this other kind of set of norms, and here is a way to sort of survive in that. That's my understanding of the best way to kind of teach code switching. I do think that you're in a unique environment on the stage to correct that more so than sort of
And
safer space for that.
I don't even try to correct it or have them change it. I'm just saying, if you're going to do a period piece that was written in 1912 and you're playing this character, you would pronounce this way more than likely. And it's just like you would wear an appropriate piece of clothing, or your manners would be a certain way based upon where you were. So I try to do it by saying you're adopting a character, and this character would speak this way. But you're right. I don't say, but don't ever do this again. I say you are who you are, and you have your.
Sounds like you're doing it the right way.
Good. I don't try to correct. I just try to enhance.
And make sure where it's coming from, because I think that's what allows it to not land necessarily personally, and they can see, okay, I'm being given this feedback so that I can do these things, right? Allowing, kind of answering their potential why. I think without that, it could feel like, oh, you just want me to say something differently because of X.
Using the terminology I've just heard, I'm always saying, this is what I can do to help you, and not just change it because it's wrong.
Yeah, but I think on the stage you have that easy case is made, right? Because you're embodying a character. There are other situations where I've heard that exact word as I actually don't pronounce it. I've never learned how to pronounce it correctly. But we've had some very interesting. I've had some very interesting experiences with trying to get people to understand when it's necessary. Like you said, if you're putting on a character and that character would talk that way, then that makes sense. But in a lot of cases, you'll find people just assuming that people are mispronouncing it because they can't pronounce it or because they have never been exposed to it, and that's when it can become almost a little microaggressive, right? But it seems like, the intention is being made clear at every step of the thing you're addressing. So I don't.
Yeah.
Good here. Good. It's like Nevada.
Yeah, like those things. I struggle with ass. I can't do that, or anything that has SKS. Desks. Sometimes I put another S, but I'll learn it if I'm performing. I do some poetry, right? So there are times when I'm like, okay, this is worth me figuring out. But overall, you never want to be correcting somebody's general dialect just for the sake of saying this is more correct. I guess unless you're an English teacher.
No, if anything, they can help me to teach that dialect in other situations.
Yeah.
Thanks, Chanel.
Well, I learned something. I learned so much today. Thank you, Meagan. Just that the animated piece was really powerful in that you showed about the race. That was very powerful to me, and thinking about the barriers rather than how hard people work, because there's so many things. I just think about, I just recently, something was pointed out to me that I hadn't thought about, and that is during holidays in some of the minority communities, they fire off guns instead of using fireworks. And so those bullets have to drop somewhere, and they drop down into people's homes, which cause holes in the roofs. And then people have to deal with the water coming in, when it rains, because we're in Louisiana, it rains a lot. And just even something like that, the idea, not only the safety aspect of the gunshots, but things like, you're in a rent house, then all of a sudden your children have holes in the roofs, water is coming in, the mold builds up, and just those things that are out of people's control that just put them at such a disadvantage. That's all.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks, Allison. And so again, you're doing what we're asking, right? It's just thinking about what else might be true and to, pushing that further and exploring it rather than just making bold assumptions about people and what we believe is their value or their ethic. Chanel, feel free if you've got anything you want to add in here.
I think I'm just very present with the fact that understanding any of these things for the first time, but really ever, can be a huge cognitive load. So, I mean, I do consulting on these things, I do research on these things, but every time I'm faced with it, I still have to kind of process and let things land as they do. So I think the only thing I could probably contribute is just, for anyone else who's experiencing that as well, let it take its time, let us take its process. Like she said, the workshop on the way the brain works would be really helpful to kind of help you understand how you might be able to process this. But your brain kind of needs time with this new pathway, right? It needs time with extending that pathway. And anytime you recall something, you're actually editing your brain's understanding of it, right? So it being present in the conversation today actually, counts as its own version of work, right? And its own version of exploring the pathway. So it's just churning up here.
Yeah.
That's the only thing I can really contribute. Let it churn.
Thanks, Chanel. Yeah, I think it's a great point because it might be easy as a participant to look at anybody who talks about these things and thinks they have it figured out. But hey, folks, I don't. Like, I am still struggling with this stuff. I'm still growing. I'm still learning. And it is a constant journey and one I will never finish, right? It's something I will always be working on. And so many of the things that I teach now, I didn't have any clue about, 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago. And it's because I continued to seek out opportunities to learn and to think and to perceive the world differently. And that's my goal. I just want to push that along and help other people because someone helped me and I want to help other people learn those things. So Katrina, and Cheryl, thanks for your comment in the chat. I'm glad to hear that you are taking something away from the session. Any other questions? Let me jump back to the chat here. So Debbie says, I've learned a lot about equity and equality over the last couple of years. I never realized how important it was until it was put into simple examples like what was used in this discussion. Oh, thanks, Debbie. Appreciate that. Monica says, I don't have a question, but appreciate the what versus why. We go straight to the why question when the best way to improve a situation is to ask what. Yeah, excellent. Great. That is a strong takeaway. All right. Well, if you need to contact me, my email is mp@engineerinclusion.com. I always welcome your feedback or questions if you start to sort of noodle on this later on in a different kind of way and want to reach out, please do that. And you can always find me on my website at engineerinclusion.com.